Can you give us an example of a specific untruth?
Well, the book's full of them, right? So the untruth is that just to start to walk through the book with the untruths, would be that the stress that children are going through adolescence is due to hormonal upheaval, right? I'm saying that that's a totally dishonest, cave-dwelling truth, right? And so what I'm going to do with this book is go through and explain all the great mysteries in science. First of all, chapter 1, I've got to connect you with the human condition, this theory that we are all living in denial, right? And I agree, you should take that on board with a pinch of salt and say, okay, I get what your argument is, let's see if it works, right? Let's put it to the test. And the ultimate test being if it starts to make our own life transparent, because that would be, as Einstein said, truth what stands the test of experience. So if our own experience of this, as being about us, is that it starts to make everything around us clear as we start seeing through everything, then that's how powerfully honest it is. But anyway, chapter 1 starts to go through and it says, so the premise of the book is, I'm going to explain human behaviour from a profound, honest base. To do that, I need to make us aware of the human condition. So I made you aware by presenting all this stuff. So now let's go and look at biology. So then I begin, let's get serious. So now you understand, or you've got an appreciation that we may be living in denial of the human condition. Now, let's take that as an assumption and then let's look at all the biological arguments that we've been living with, that biology has been giving us. So I begin by saying, well, what is science? So I explain that science is mechanistic and reductionist. It's living in denial of this subject matter. It's not looking at the overview. It's reducing its focus to looking down on the details and mechanisms and avoiding this overarching bigger issue of the human condition because it can't confront it. They're all run scientists are humans living in denial, supposedly resigned adults living in denial of the human condition. So they're mechanistic and reductionist. They're looking down at the details, not at the overview, which is unbearable until we find the explanation of it. So, as Let It Be says, until there will be some answers one day, but until then, let it be. Don't go there because you give yourself a hiding. And so the book then goes through all the biological ideas, and it starts off with social Darwinism. Because Darwin originally said, when his idea of natural selection, that in his first 2 editions, or 3 editions, I think, he didn't use the word survival of the fittest. He said there's some survive and some don't. As to whether those that survive are better, could be considered better or superior, he said, I'm not going to make it that judgment. In fact, you'll see in chapter 3 that's explained that to be altruistic and give your life for the greater whole, to maintain the greater whole, can actually be meaningful, more meaningful than being selfish. But that's when you get to chapter 3. So Darwin was actually right not to sort of to say that you were better if you survived. But his mates, Spencer and Huck and Wallace, they persuaded him to use the word survival of the fittest. So he said, okay. And that was a coup for the cave dwellers, because suddenly you could use Darwin's idea of natural selection to say those that survive are the winners. Survival of the fittest. They're fitter than everybody else. That's why they should survive. So now businessmen say, well, we're the best, shoemakers in the industry because we're the best, survival of the fittest, Darwin said it, we're the best competitors. But you see, so that's a lie because Darwin was actually honest. They turn it, so I'm saying it's called social Darwinism because it's used throughout industry and everywhere to justify selfishness. But in fact, Darwin wasn't going to go that road until his arm was twisted. So then I begin to go through all the different biological theories and dismantle them and reveal what they're really doing, because I'm saying I know what the game plan is behind all the behaviour, all their actions, all their theories. The game plan is to avoid the human condition. They're living in the cave of denial. They're not being honest. They're trying to find another way, a more clever way to avoid the human condition. And so it goes on and talks about evolutionary psychology and all these other theories, which says, because there's some big problems with social Darwinism, because there's some, like bees and so on, and they're so unconditionally selfless. They give their life for the queen, and they're unconditionally selfless. So survival of the fittest, trying to be the winner, is not a universal phenomenon in nature, because bees are selfless. And we've got our own moral instincts to explain. Our conscience, which wants us to behave in a cooperative, loving way. So there's some big holes in social Darwinism. So then, to counter that idea, they came up with another theory and said that they're just indirectly reproducing their genes by the queens. The ants who are selfless and bees that give their life, when a bee stings you, it dies on behalf of the colony. So it's altruistic, but it's actually not altruistic because in sacrificing its life, it's maintaining the queen, the colony, and the queen reproduces its genes. So it's indirectly fostering its own genes. So it's actually ultimately still selfish. But the trick they did with evolutionary psychology is then they took the next step and applied that to our human moral instincts and said that they're also driven by us trying reciprocity, us trying to reproduce our genes by fostering others who are related to us. And then when they took that step, that was a fraud. That was a human condition avoiding dishonest use of the truth that bees and ants do foster their own reproduction indirectly by fostering the queen. We're not doing that. As you'll see, some biologists said, that's ridiculous. I don't help people across the road because I'm not even related to them, I'm not trying to reproduce my own genes. So there's a flaw in that theory. So then they came up with another theory, and it goes on. And the book traces all these things. But because I've got in place this idea that we're living in denial, that's underlying all our behaviour, this is cave-dwelling behaviour that's going to go on here. You start looking at all these biological theories, you can dismantle them and see that they are, in fact, lying through their teeth. They're finding a way to avoid the human condition. They keep faking it because if you're living in the cave, you can't walk around and say, look, I'm faced the human condition. When you resign, you decide to lie, to not face that truth again. So you've got to come up with some excuse. You've got to say, we're competitive and selfish because of our animal heritage, that we want to reproduce our genes, which is rubbish. We suffer from a psychological condition, not an animal, reproduce your genes condition. So we have all these lies. So the first chapter is really, really powerful, and it's only because it can dismantle all of current biological thinking. And it can only do that because I first got in place this explanation made you aware that we're living in denial of the human condition. So I argue, we're looking in denial of the human condition. These are Plato and all these guys said, so this is resignation, so this is what's happening. Okay, let's take this theory and see if it applies. Let's look at all the biology that's supposedly explaining us. And when you take that with you and you start looking at it, all dismantles instantly. And biologists comment about just how extraordinary, accountable, how quick I'm able to dismantle all those theories, which there's books and books written about them. But because I'm using this insight, that what their game plan really is, I can suddenly make it transparent what's going on. So the end of chapter 1 is a dismantling of biology, all the theories, based on that they're pretending, they're lying, they're trying to avoid the human condition, they're not trying to face it. So then I switch into different gear and go to chapter 2 and say, now let's try a different tack. Let's actually try to confront the human condition and see if we can make sense of human behaviour. Instead of what they're doing is trying to avoid it and not getting anywhere. You can't find the truth from lies. You can't find the truth from in the cave. As Plato said, you've got to be outside the cave.